Thank you for the wonderful introduction. I'll say a couple words actually to clarify and maybe correct some updates and things about what I do and the framework for this. I'm going to talk about supply chain independence primarily and the need for US-Japan coordination. I teach, as Patsy mentioned, operations management and supply chain management. And I also teach this new course that I created called Supply Chain Decarbonization at both NYU's, and also at the University of Pennsylvania. And at NYU, I teach at the business school as well as the engineering school. So these are the curricula that I teach, and it might give you a framework for what we're going to talk about in supply chain today. Some of the books that may interest you and can also inform you my points of view on some different areas. Of course, this Guide to Supply Chain Management was my first book for The Economist. But then some other books that might come up, that are going to come up in the conversation today, include Trump, Trade, and the End of Globalization, which has more of political overtones to it in terms of supply chain and trade analysis. And also From Bogota to Beijing. And this latest book here might interest some of you, called Getting to Net Zero, which is about how to decarbonize companies. So we're going to talk a little bit about energy. And to that end, there is a book called Reinventing the Energy Value Chain and Optimal Supply Chain Management in Oil, Gas, and Power Generation. It is very relevant to the conversation. And that's why I'm showing you. This company, Boston Strategies International, is a consulting firm on global strategy and value chains. We don't need to talk about that so much, but it might explain why the letterhead reads Boston Strategies. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about four things. The first is the historical evolution of global supply chains. And then we're going to dive into the supply chain disruptions that occurred primarily in the period 1990 to 2020. And then kind of update with specifically what happened between 2020 and the present, which is kind of more turbulence, a story of more turbulence when you think it would be less. And then we'll really spend some time on the need for US-Japan collaboration for enhanced supply chain independence, which I think is a very interesting sort of follow-up to Dr. Suzuki's comments about the Japanese political structures and mechanisms and the world alliances and how they're evolving. To give you a little bit of an executive summary of what the rest of what I'm going to say in a little bit more detail, we're going to talk about the transition from manufacturing to service industries, growing imports and trade deficits and dependence on China. As Patsy said, that's kind of the common underlying theme for supply chain disruptions and the massive impact that they've had. And within that area, we're going to talk about three specific trends. One is disindustrialization. The second is deglobalization. And the third is polarization. That's more political, but it's also economic. The more recent events include the Ukraine war. We'll talk about the impacts of that on the supply chains, and that's where energy supply chains become particularly relevant. Of course, there's the story of the pandemic, which is pretty much past us, but it's had long-lasting effects. The energy transition and the fourth industrial revolution, which I can define and explain as we go forward. And we'll talk about the need for collaboration. I'm going to talk about why I think multilateral cooperation is important. It's not possible to achieve some of the objectives that are coming up for supply chain independence if every country operates on its own. And to that end, then there will be some suggestions that I'll make for joint technological research, joint supply chain planning, and joint commercial investments. So first, looking at the evolution of global supply chains over a longer time period, really most of the OECD countries have been making a transition from manufacturing to services for quite a long time. And this has been driven in large part by tariff reductions made at the World Trade Organization and the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which came about quite some time ago now, decades and decades ago. Historically, tariffs in the United States, even before the Civil War, were actually quite high. and then they declined significantly between the Civil War and the Second World War. What really kind of happened after the Second World War is the World Trade Organization and its precursors helped drive the world tariff rates much lower, to the point now where basically around the world, most of the rates were around less than 10%. And that drove a lot of free trade. It was astonishing, actually, the growth in free trade. So this is basically my lifespan, and probably the life experience of a lot of us. Global trade soared between the 60s and 2009, and the value of global exports with it, both volume and value. And so this has been a lot of my experience professionally and also personally. Of course, a lot of this came from China. We're going to dissect where exactly it came from and why, but the exports from China follow a similar hockey stick curve, and just astonishing from about 1985 or 90 to the present. And I tracked a lot of this as part of my work over time. The year-on-year growth of exports from China throughout that whole period were just astonishing, actually. Today, the United States relies on China for 19% of its imports, and it is the largest trading partner from an import perspective. Mexico is next, which is kind of interesting because Mexico is right next door, and Canada also. So our next door neighbors account for more of the trade combined than China, but not a whole lot. And then Japan is 5% of our imports, of course, and a lot of other countries. The U.S.'s imports from China are mostly in the information and communication technologies segment, especially electronics products involving computers, toys, and things like that. And Japan relies on China for about 25% of its imports, and then the United States for 11%. So there, as you can see, there's a very integrated triangle between Japan, China, and the United States, and the United States and Japan have a lot in common regarding their trade relationship with China. Japan also imports many of the same items and commodities from China that the United States does. 8% of the total is computers, so there's a lot of this ICT, information and communication technology, products, and transmission apparatus. So these charts look very similar, and that's very striking from the point of view. So what has this resulted in? These increasing imports on both the side of the United States and Japan from China have resulted in trade deficits, which have been a source of public debate for a long time. The United States imports have exceeded exports since about 1990. It's the same period of time during which China has risen. And so the deficit here is marked with a pink color. And it's over the same period of time, or roughly the same period of time in this graph, Japan's balance of trade has been erratic, but has also in recent years been negative, that meaning a trade deficit. So this is a zero line right here. I don't know if my pointer is showing that. Can you see my pointer? Yeah, okay. So the zero line is no trade deficit or surplus. So there was a surplus, and then it went into deficit, surplus, deficit. And Japan is now running a deficit, a trade deficit with China as well. So now we're in the same boat, basically. Now we have this trade deficit with China. And it's a concern from not only an economic point of view, but from a strategic point of view. There was a point earlier in my education and career when there was an argument that trade deficits didn't matter. You could just fund them, especially with specific countries. And so I think the issue with a trade deficit for China has more to do with strategic interests and industrial base and capability and capacity than it does with a specific. I mean, if all of what we were buying from China was was insignificant, and band-aids and little things, it probably wouldn't matter. But the volume and the value and the strategic nature of what is done to the industrial bases of it's combined with the disindustrialization, it makes a really substantial worry for both countries. So the graph here shows it quite clearly that while the United States has actually not lost its industrial capacity, what's happening is all of the growth in new industrial capacity has actually come from China. So there's been a sort of a steady growth minus the impact of the global financial crisis. The United States does still have a manufacturing sector. I know Professor Suzuki referred to the Rust Belt in the United States. So the Rust Belt is a little bit of a anachronism, story of 2000, let's say 2005 through 2015. The manufacturing sector is alive in the United States, and those areas, in many areas, have actually resiliently kind of come back and are now tech centers and whatever. So there is, but what's different is that a lot of the growth was picked up by China during this period. On this graph, you can see actually as a proportion of global manufacturing output by country, one line is increasing on this chart is China. So China is the only line between 1990 and 2008 that grew. All the other countries' shares of global manufacturing output decreased or stayed steady. And most importantly, on this chart, most relevant to us, the United States has decreased in global terms, and Japan has decreased in global terms, and China has risen. So that's kind of a story that goes on here. This disindustrialization has brought the United States down on a precipitous decline, actually, as a percent of GDP. Now, GDP has grown, so that's a little bit of a strange oxymoron here. But I wrote a report for Boston Strategies in about this period here, and we were questioning what would happen, and what did happen is a continuous erosion. This is the story for Japan. Japan is up around here. It's not as eroded as the United States. Japan still has more industrial and manufacturing base than the United States does as a percentage of its economy. One of the major stories of this disindustrialization of the United States has to do with the offshoring of the semiconductor industry, which was done in 3 phases from all the way from the 60s forward. And a lot of that had to do with initially with labor costs, secondarily with environmental restrictions in the United States, and there was just many reasons for this going abroad, and political incentives and economic incentives on the part of Taiwan. So basically, Taiwan picked up so much of the semiconductor industry while the United States let it go away, and now this is a big issue, as we'll talk more about. So as tariffs fell toward zero, and we continued to try to reduce them in various free trade regimes, the World Trade Organization went through various rounds of trade negotiation to try to get the rates lower in specific segments. And what happened was all the rounds took 3 to 5 years, 7 years, but then they started taking a lot longer. And this one here, the Doha round, failed. And that's basically, I mean, I might be familiar with that, but the Doha round completely failed and never concluded. And what this basically is representing is the trend of anti-globalism and the concerns over displaced and offshored and outsourced jobs, careers and industries, and income inequality. And also on top of that, what I call environmental dumping, because I also track a lot of environmental regulations, and there had to be a number of global protocols around environmental, the shipping of environmental waste and toxic substances from the rich countries to the poorer countries during this period, because this whole sort of inequity, as this whole inequity story played out around the world, which was kind of brought to light, especially by these Occupy Wall Street strikes and protests in 2011. So this is in conjunction with all the trade falling regimes falling apart, the free trade regime falling apart particularly. And Trump enacted these import tariffs on basically number one, anything from China, number two, steel and aluminum, number three, autos, number four, solar panels, and then some other things. And the tariffs came into effect here. This was the year is not mentioned here. I believe that year is 2017. I could pull it up, but you'll see on the next slide as well. So what was important was these China Section 301 tariffs, which were basically on U.S. trade with China, which added 10 to 25% tariffs on everything coming from China, pretty much. Now, what's interesting about this story is that these have not gone away. I'll talk more about that later, but it got to a level now where U.S. tariffs on Chinese goods averaged 19%. And China, of course, retaliated, and I'll talk more about that in a minute, with tariffs on U.S. exports of slightly higher, pretty similar, and even higher rates. And then both countries actually started also putting tariffs on goods imports from other countries as well. Rest of the world is what ROW stands for. So it's basically a classic trade war occurring here, and it sort of blew up the whole free trade global regime, which had been put in place kind of since the WTO was formed. These affected huge portions of the economy and still do, because this is a 2023 graph here. This shows the 2018, but then the previous one went up through 2023. I'm actually trying to find out how to hide this little toolbar so I can, let's just put it up there for me. So yeah, this is 2021 too. So this is current. So these affect 2/3 of all the exports. So the way they were put in place was massive and on a broad scale. And actually they still exist because in many respects, the Biden administration pretty much left a lot of these tariffs in place. They were removed for some of the allies. But the China Section 301 tariffs have not gone away, and the WTO is still kneecapped primarily by the United States, which kind of refused to nominate parties for the appeals process. But what's happening is this reshifting, which Dr. Suzuki was talking a little bit with, of alliances between China, Russia, maybe some Middle Eastern countries and other Asian countries, like we were talking about. And meanwhile, China, the trade deficits with China continue to increase. So all this activity is having no effect on the imports from China, none. Maybe some, but overall, this shows the trade deficit with China and the United States side. It went down a bit, but it's coming back up again, and it's still higher than ever. And even Japan's trade deficit with China, it decreased, and now it's increasing again. So it's hard to argue that this has been effective. So on top of that, there's been more turbulence in the supply chain since 2020, including the pandemic, which was the ultimate supply chain disaster caused by a lot of the manufacturing shutdowns, and also by the shift towards goods from services, because all that whole servicification of the economy that had been going on for years and years changed during the pandemic as everybody who was sitting at home decided to order things for home delivery. So suddenly the demand for goods shifted from all those services which everybody had been consuming when they were out doing things and buying services. Suddenly they said, give me some more goods for my house. So the supply chains also couldn't handle that. That's a major shift right in a very short period of time. Yeah, so it's very significant, as significant as the global financial crisis, one could roughly say, and the price of shipping and everything went crazy, crazy, like 4 or 5 times the previous rates. And if you were in shipping, there just wasn't enough capacity to move things around. That was the beginning of the real problems in the supply chain. Now, fast forward to the Ukraine war, natural gas flows had to shift very abruptly as a result of the war, because Europe bought 83% of its natural gas from other parties, and over half of that was from Russia. So as Europe put sanctions on Russian gas being piped in from Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2 pipelines, then Europe had to basically find alternative sources. And what was done was a cap on the price for buying Russian oil and gas, which limited the amount of money that any European importer was allowed to pay for Russian oil and gas of various types. Europe started using up all its liquefied natural gas capacity to try to. It was buying gas from other sources, including the United States and other partners as well in the Middle East and Asia, and therefore it used up all its liquefied natural gas terminal capacity. And this was in the middle of the winter, as you may recall, and so the need for heat was very, very, very important. Nobody wanted to run short. So what Europe did was they started setting up all these new LNG terminals. Here was the map before the Ukraine war, and here are the new facilities. As you can see, it's roughly like 50% more terminals than were previously in there, which is very, very difficult to pull off very quickly. And but that's what was done. So now the upshot of this story with the Ukraine war and following on the heels of the pandemic is that most of the countries have been striving for energy independence. Now, energy independence is not a new objective. A lot of countries have always wanted to be energy independent, but now it seems like quite a necessity because with countries like with such a blatant demonstration, such as the Ukraine war, of how energy can be cut off, then it's become so obvious that countries have to make their energy supply independent from some of these countries. These are the major countries with oil and gas in particular. As you can see, Russia is a major gas producer, Saudi Arabia is a major oil producer. These are ranked by reserves, not production. Japan also imports most of its energy, and so here's where you start to see the energy and the supply chain story converge, because the energy imports are part of the supply chain, and it really is shifting tectonically the movements in global supply chains as well as the energy world, and that of course is geopolitical power. And so now Japan is looking toward LNG and nuclear as potential alternatives to the fossil fuels. And that is, of course, a major political and social debate in terms of safety, in terms of defense, in terms of independence and security. So this has all become a very, what supply chains historically were this very predictable, very boring thing that kind of only involved warehouse workers shipping plastic and electronic products. Now it's a geopolitical story of interest to everybody for these reasons. And on top of that, there's the energy transition, which is accentuating the importance of energy independence even more, because with climate change and the need to reduce the use of fossil fuels, we move toward renewables. But guess what? The renewables depend on a lot of inputs here to make the products. To make solar panels, you need rare earths. Those are need to be mined, and they're rare, as it connotes in the title. You need strategic and core minerals, and you need some other minerals that are only available in certain countries in certain quantities, and also require a lot of extraction and a lot of processing to get to where they need to go to build things like wind turbine blades and high temperature generators and any motors and all kinds of renewable energy products are dependent on these specific commodities, and those processing of all that stuff drives jobs at all levels of the value chain, so from laboratories through the mining, through the manufacturing, the processing. I'll show you. And it's important to low-cost energy, and it has an economic multiplier effect on the whole economy. So you have supply chain explosions here. This is a whole new network of supply chains that are being set up. And and again, you come back, and China comes in again, because where are those minerals? Guess what? China has a lot of them. So China has a monopoly, in fact, on several types of as was alluded to actually in some of the previous discussion, on certain types of strategic minerals. And this is a matrix that shows U.S. net import reliance against the China net import reliance, which is a very strategic way to look at it. Namely, that this top quadrant, where both countries are import reliant, is actually a source of potential conflict. And where natural resources are at stake and countries vie for them, often there is economic war and sometimes political war as well. Actual physical war. So bringing these new minerals to market is very complex. They're high tech. It's not the kind of it's not like coal mining. In coal mining, you mine it, you crush it, you kind of run it through you run some water over it, you spray it, and then you burn it, right? But to get these rare earths and critical minerals into things like wind turbine generators and wind turbine blades and things, there's a lot of processing. It's very high tech. In fact, there are a lot of these processes that are really pretty much only in the known and familiar to this very specialized scientists and metallurgists and things like that. So, but that's the new supply chain that we're talking about. It's very high tech, and it's very intensive, and it's also very high value. And this brings up how to set it up, because most usually, in my opinion, and the opinion of a lot of other people, clusters make the most sense. If you're going to produce a whole value chain, if you're going to build it from scratch, why not build it in co-located areas or countries, so that you can do the processing near the extraction, and then you can have it near the market that you're selling it to. It would reduce the cost a lot of the finished product. And so there's a lot of thought going into how to structure these new supply chains. And we just worked, my company, the consulting firm Boston Strategies, just did work for the U.S. Department of Energy on that. And on top of that, there's the fourth industrial revolution, which is the need to develop supply chains for intelligent automation. The fourth industrial revolution involves all of the Internet of Things and devices that go on or are used all around us, and are becoming increasingly smart, especially with artificial intelligence and data analytics combined with cloud computing. All these things combined with electric and autonomous vehicles are driving new supply chains. They're both driving the need for supply chains for automation equipment and software, but they're also driving they're changing the nature of supply chains. And to that end, I've written a book with two Boston University professor colleagues called AI-Driven Supply Chains, Retooling the Economy. It has enormous implications for jobs as all these traditional supply chain jobs go away, and a lot of new ones come on stream. Interestingly enough, when you look at that book and the citations that we make to companies in their high-tech companies in different countries, most of those are in the United States. And some of them I've mentioned here are Japanese, so there is room for overlap there. But a lot of it's US driven, and I would say that's not totally our perspective only, because one of my co-authors is Chinese and one is European, so that's a kind of a fairly unbiased view. So with all that noise and all that confusion, and you can probably see, basically the story I'm telling is that these supply chains have emerged to become an enormously important and also an enormously complex web to untangle going forward. And when we think about how to transition the supply chains for everything from consumer products to electronics to energy, the need, it's really not possible for countries to do that on their own. And the reason I say that is because some of those and very strategic supply chains involve economies of scale. they will only be successful at a high scale. And another reason is that if you're wrong and you go into the wrong, say, energy technology, you go into nuclear fusion or something that's really highly capital intense, and if you're wrong, then it's a huge financial hit. And on the relatively easier stuff, there are stimulus packages for reshoring. There's a lot contained in the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States and the CHIPS Act for semiconductors. Now, this one is tricky because, well, it's huge in terms of dollars. It's over $50 billion in grants. And we have the chairman, we have Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation locating a plant in Arizona. This is a major tough one. Carbon ore, rare earth, and critical minerals initiatives are also very tough. And so some of these things were relatively easy, like domestic manufacturing protection, but they get increasingly complex, and it's very difficult to do that as one country alone. Of course, the U.S. can do it as so large. We have a lot of room for economies of scale in our economy. Japan is also stimulating reshoring in many essential areas of products, parts, and materials in recognition of the economic benefit that drives from those supply chains through the multiplier effect. Here are some of the industries that are concerned, and the Ministry of Trade and Industry has identified these 60 or so projects in different Asian countries to diversify from China. So there's a lot of effort going on in Japan as well to diversify from Chinese imports. When we think about how this is all going to play out, and we look at the multi-billion-dollar infrastructure requirements for some of these supply chains, particularly in semiconductor manufacturing, nuclear power, hydrogen development as an alternative energy for fossil fuels, and battery manufacturing, and it really, these take a lot of time and a lot of governance structures. So they can't just be done entirely by the private sector. There's a lot of governance related to safety, particularly when it comes to nuclear and hydrogen. And there's a lot of regulatory frameworks for some of these very large companies in making the investments now. And there's a lot of requirements for permitting, wind farms, nuclear sites, even semiconductor manufacturing having to do with the toxicity of the waste and what's the health issues involved. So all these issues, including financing, call for government coordination and action. And I think that basically leaves a common desire among both Japan and the United States to kind of trigger some of this, catalyze some of this positive change on development of supply chains, particularly strategic supply chains. And to that end, the US and Japan have been meeting and have had a number of agreements so far. One of these has been the Critical Minerals Agreement, which has some coordination at high policy levels and a recognition of the fact that there needs to be some information sharing and some policy coordination on intellectual property violations and similar things. So in sum, I basically think that there's a real opportunity here for joint research on all levels. There's a concept called technology readiness levels, TRLs, which maps technologies as they move through different stages of development. And I think we could do some of that mapping together. There's also basic research, academic, and I'll call it lab research, but it's even pre-lab research. It's fundamental physics, fundamental assessment of different technology potential in certain areas, very specific, like high capacity batteries or solid state lithium-ion batteries, etc. And there's prototyping that can be done in all the area of research. And then as you look into these complex multi-tier supply chains, a lot of this is technico-economic analysis, which could also benefit from collaboration and coordination, and strategic areas where we could actually jointly address some of these challenges and win. So without actually putting dollars in together or making some of these things. There are a lot of soft ways in which we could collaborate and mutually benefit. And then, of course, there is the opportunity to actually jointly fund some of these things. I'm thinking of the Airbus experience, which was actually global, especially pan-European, and where there are other examples of major industrial champions. This might be an opportunity in semiconductors. It might be an opportunity in some areas of nuclear and renewable energy technologies, and it might be an opportunity in battery manufacturers. Not sure that, of course, either country is willing to go there, given some of the comments that were made earlier about the America First agenda and what it means for collaboration of the hard sort, I mean, involving money and political commitments. But at least at the level of academic research, collaborations, and scientific coordination, I think there's a substantial runway for joint collaboration for mutual benefit in the development of new supply chains that are resilient and independent. So I think that's probably where I'll leave it. But I thank you very much for your time. I realize